Perfect. Thank you, everyone that has been joining us in this Conserving Monarchs Opportunities on Corridors in Canada webinar. My name is Georgina O'Farrell, and I'm a project coordinator here at the Commission for Environmental Cooperation. The mission of the CEC is to facilitate collaboration and public participation to foster conservation, protection, and enhancement of the North American environment for the benefit of present and future generations, in the context of increasing economy, trade, and social links among Canada, Mexico, and the United States. We are really happy to have this webinar today, and the webinar has been prepared by Vicki Wojcik, I hope I pronounced it correctly, Vicki, from Pollinator Partnership Canada. Just to give you a brief overview of what's Pollinator Partnership, the mission of Pollinator Partnership is to promote the health of pollinators, critical to food and ecosystems, through conservation, education, and research. Pollinator Partnership Canada was founded in 2013 and more effectively targets the unique opportunities and challenges faced by Canada's pollinators and the ecosystems and economies that depend on them. Pollinator Partnership Canada works closely with local nonprofit organizations, charities, businesses, and governments, and also partners with U.S. and Mexican groups to support cross-border and migratory pollinators throughout North America. I'm really happy, and we have been working very closely with Vicki Wojcik on the preparation of this webinar. So I'm just going to provide a brief introduction for Vicki. Vicki is a Research and Canadian Programs Director at Pollinator Partnership Canada. Vicki has been working to protect and promote pollinators with Pollinator Partnership since 2011. As Research Director, she oversees Pollinator Partnership's research program, keeping on top of new and emerging pollinator issues. Vicki holds a PhD in Environmental Science, Policy, and Management from UC Berkeley. She has been at Pollinator Partnership, and her contributions to pollinator research and conservation include numerous peer-reviewed papers, book chapters, policy pieces, planting guides, and technical manuals. Before we start the webinar, I just want to tell everybody that has joined us that you can write your questions all along the webinar. We're going to be keeping those questions, and then we'll have a question period at the end of the presentation. I really hope you enjoyed this webinar, and I'll just give the microphone to Vicki.
Thanks, Georgina. I really appreciate the introduction, and thank you everyone for taking the time to attend today's webinar. Just giving you an overview of the topics we'll discuss in today's hour, I want to go over the monarch life cycle and migration to really provide the context of the biology of this species to help you better understand how corridors and the landscapes you manage can be a fit for monarch conservation. We'll speak of some of the conservation challenges and status of the monarch butterfly today, and go into some detail about corridors in particular, highlighting best management practices and various activities that you can do that promote monarchs. I'll also provide you some background information on how to engage in a monarch habitat planting project with some case studies of successful programs, and then talk about the monitoring, outreach, and recognition opportunities that exist. So it's a very busy schedule for our hour, so pay attention. It's a recorded webinar, so if anything moves a bit quickly or you miss something, there'll be an opportunity to follow up. So first, let's have a look at the monarch butterfly life cycle. The monarch butterfly has a very standard life cycle of any butterfly. It goes through 4 phases, beginning with an egg that's laid. This egg hatches into a caterpillar, and a caterpillar feeds off of the host plant that it's laid on. In the case of a monarch, it's a milkweed, and grows through various molts and growth phases that are called instars. Once the caterpillar reaches a certain size, it then looks for a place that's sheltered and protected for it to develop into a pupa. Over a week or two, the caterpillar will undergo metamorphosis in its pupa state and then emerge as an adult butterfly. And this cycle, again, is very, very common, the exact same cycle that happens in all butterflies and moths. So let's have another quick look at that. Just a highlight of what a monarch butterfly egg looks like. It's quite small, between 1 and 1.5 millimeters, and it's laid on the underside of a milkweed plant leaf. The next image shows a newly hatched monarch caterpillar. This caterpillar is very, very tiny, and the first thing it does is feed off of its eggshell so that it can get some nutrients before it starts to feed on the milkweed itself. These two caterpillars here eating a milkweed leaf are more familiar to us. They're the brilliant black, white, and yellow striping pattern that we're used to seeing on a monarch caterpillar. And this slide that I like to share with you just shows you some comparison of the various sizes of monarch butterfly caterpillars as they eat and grow and molt through their various instars or developmental phases. The monarch caterpillar actually grows almost 2,000 times its size in a short period, about 1 to 2 weeks, depending on the temperature and how much food availability there is. One way that's very telling of how large a monarch butterfly caterpillar is and what instar it's in is by looking at those long tentacles, which are actually sensory organs on the caterpillar itself. And they tell you a lot about the age. So the longer they are and the more they stick out over the head, the older instar caterpillar you have. And now we have an image of a monarch chrysalis. It's a brilliant pale emerald green with some gold highlights on it. It's really quite beautiful. Now, it would be unlikely for you to see these commonly in the field, especially on milkweed, because as the caterpillars move on to a life phase of the pupa, they look for a secluded, sheltered area. So it's often away from the milkweed plant, commonly on another tree or perhaps on a fence post or something like that. And then we have an image of an emerged monarch butterfly adult nectaring on a milkweed plant. So what's actually quite unique about the monarch butterfly life cycle, which is very different from a lot of butterfly life cycles, is that this development from egg to caterpillar to pupa to adult actually happens multiple times throughout the year and throughout the entire continent. So it changes through space and time. The monarch butterfly annual cycle actually includes 4 generations of butterflies that exist in different parts of North America and all end up being part of this unique phenomenon. So if you follow along quickly, there are butterflies that are overwintering in Mexico. When the weather starts to trigger better temperatures and the signals to the butterfly that it's time to move north, they break out of their hibernation and start flying north. The first generation of monarch butterflies is laid at the southern portion of the United States. These monarch butterflies hatch, go through their caterpillar, pupa, and adult phase, mate again, and fly further north. A second generation of monarch butterflies is born that flies north, and when we actually see monarch butterflies in Canada, so primarily southern Ontario and southern Quebec, we're seeing the second generation or the grandchildren of the butterflies that left Mexico. They lay eggs. The eggs hatch into caterpillars that pupate into an adult. They mate, and then again, while they're resident here in the northern range of their breeding range, they lay eggs again. Another caterpillar hatches and pupates and mates, and then once again, they lay eggs and another caterpillar hatches, and it's this 4th generation or the great-great-grandchildren of those butterflies that left Mexico that make the final migration back down to the overwintering grounds. So it's a fascinating phenomenon where you have a butterfly that has never made the journey, making its way back to overwintering grounds, and then the cycle starts again. So each year, more than 50 million monarch butterflies make this 5,000 kilometer journey round trip, and it really is quite fascinating. It's a wonderful phenomenon. This graph here, or this map rather, shows you an example of how monarch butterflies move across the continent. There are two main monarch migratory routes. The one that we're focusing on today is the one that's relevant to southern Ontario, southern Quebec, sometimes Manitoba and New Brunswick as well, and it's the Central Eastern Flyway, sometimes called the flyway that goes through the Corn Belt. There is another western monarch migration where monarch butterflies are moving from as far north as Washington State, sometimes cresting into British Columbia, and then they overwinter in Central California. The monarch butterflies that we see here in Ontario or in Quebec, they're overwintering in the OML forests of Mexico. And potentially, it's a little unclear, but potentially there are some butterflies that do overwinter in Florida, but the vast majority are going from where they're born at the end of the summer, flying through the American Midwest, funneling then in through Texas, down through Mexico to the OML forests, which are just a bit north of Mexico City. And 90% of the population of monarchs that we know overwinters in this particular location in the OML forest. And here's just a shot of what those overwintering clusters might look like. An oilmail fir is a type of fir tree that grows commonly in the region, and the butterflies basically roost on that tree, cluster on it for a 2 to 3 month period when the weather is not as favorable and when they don't have as many food resources available to them. Now, we've been monitoring monarch butterflies since about the mid-90s, and we have seen a trend that's unfortunately a declining trend in the number of monarch butterflies that are making it to these overwintering grounds in Mexico. From our records, which again did start in 1995, around 1997 we had peak numbers of monarchs where there were over 18 hectares of monarch butterflies that were measured in the total forest area occupied by colonies. The lowest numbers recorded were in 2014, where there was less than a hectare of monarch butterflies recorded. Now, since then, numbers have rebounded a bit, but they're still drastically lower, and it is about a 90% decline from what we saw as a peak and ideal number of monarch butterflies back in the mid-90s. What exactly has been driving this trend? And in the last 20 years, it really is primarily linked to habitat loss from two main factors: urban sprawl and changes in agricultural practice. So almost 1 million hectares of prime farmland have been lost in the last decade in Canada. So that farmland is no longer farmland. It's primarily subdivisions and other industrial land uses. So we're losing that valuable landscape. In addition, there's been a transition in how farming practices are farming, and that's an increased use of Roundup-ready crops, which, as well as larger machinery, which has both increased the field size and reduced the availability of milkweed in the field borders adjacent to a farmer's field. So 20 years ago, it would not be uncommon to see milkweed scattered throughout the farm landscape, but today it's much more rare. And that actually was, this milkweed within agricultural areas was one of the primary habitat sources for monarch butterflies. So what exactly is monarch habitat? Since I just mentioned that there's been a drastic decline in habitat, and that's what's driving this drastic decline in monarch numbers overwintering. So monarch habitat takes two forms. Monarchs need milkweed for reproduction. So milkweed is a plant, the genus Asclepias. There's over 100 species of this plant throughout North America, In Canada, there are a few more common species, primarily Asclepias syrica, which is common milkweed, Asclepias incarnata, which is the swamp milkweed, and Asclepias tuberosa, which is butterfly milkweed. And monarchs need this plant because it's the exclusive plant on which their caterpillars can survive. If a monarch caterpillar egg is not laid on milkweed, it will not grow and develop into an adult. So it's essential that it has availability of this plant in the landscape. The other portion of monarch butterfly habitat is nectar plants, which provide the fuel for flight, daily activities, and at the end of the season for their migration back and forth between the breeding grounds in the northern parts of North America and their overwintering grounds in Mexico. Now, monarchs are generalist feeders, which means they like a large variety of flowers, but they do need nectar available throughout the year, especially when they're present in your region at the right time of year. And in the fall, so as summer comes to an end and fall is beginning, they especially need nectar sources so that they can stock up on food and fuel as they prepare for their long journey south. And the last component of monarch habitat is the overwintering roosts or the oyamel fir forests in Mexico. Now, because monarch butterflies are tied between Canada, the United States, and Mexico, they're a species of trinational importance, and monarch conservation depends on all parties working together. So through the Commission for Environmental Cooperation, the North American Conservation Plan for monarch butterflies was issued. This conservation plan outlines the strategies that each stakeholder, each government stakeholder, but also public, private, other entities can take to support monarch butterflies. And roughly speaking, what's outlined in this plan is that the role of Canada and the United States is to promote the breeding of monarchs. And the role of Mexico is to protect the overwintering colonies. Within this document, there are some conservation goals outlined for 2020, and they include increasing the amount of overwintering monarch butterflies in Mexico to 6 hectares, which represents about 225 million monarchs. This is considered a number that's relatively stable. One way to achieve this goal is to increase the availability of milkweed and nectar sources so that we can account for 1 to 1.5 billion stems of milkweed plants and nectar sources. And of course, the continued protection of the oyamel fir forest at the overwintering grounds. And the question that always comes up is, well, how will we achieve this? And it has to be an all hands on deck approach because there are so many factors and so many stakeholders involved in monarch conservation. One landscape, one stakeholder, one country won't be the solution. It does have to be all hands on deck. So I wanted to give you an overview of some of the initiatives that are going on in Mexico, the United States, and Canada before I go into how corridor landscapes can really participate in monarch conservation more broadly. So in Mexico, again, remembering that the goal is to preserve the overwintering habitats, there have been a lot of initiatives that have focused on community forestry and tourism training. So one of the threats to monarch overwintering habitats in Mexico is logging, both legal logging and illegal logging. By working with local communities, providing forestry education, and as well as shifting some income streams into tourism for monarch butterfly viewing, there have been some significant strides made in conserving and protecting the habitat area. There have been more than 56,000 hectares of biosphere preserved and protected, and it actually is becoming much more profitable and viable to participate in conservation ecotourism than logging. So this is a wonderful step forward. Within the United States, again, keeping in mind that the role of the United States, like the role of Canada, is to encourage monarch breeding, so protect that milkweed and nectar habitat. There have been quite a few initiatives, and primarily there's one along Interstate 35, which has been called the Monarch Highway. Interstate 35, shown in the bottom quadrant of this slide, basically goes from Chicago all the way to San Antonio, Texas. And it mirrors quite nicely a large portion of the Monarch Flyway, especially from the Great Lakes through the Corn Belt. So there have been a series of initiatives to encourage habitats specifically along this corridor, one of which is focusing on the roadway, I-35 itself, and ensuring that roadsides and other set-asides along that landscape are seeded actively with monarch nectar plants and milkweed seeds. There have been almost $12 million in federal funding for pollinator habitat along this corridor. But in addition, these initiatives are achieved through multi-stakeholder partnerships. So it's not just the Department of Transportation, but it's also local utilities, nearby farms, corporations that may have headquarters or land within these landscapes. And there have been quite a few private initiatives as well, funded, for example, Monsanto and General Mills all have active planting programs where you can receive seed to help support pollinators, sometimes monarchs in particular. So moving to the initiatives that are actually happening in Canada, we have a very long history of monarch butterfly conservation. In fact, the migratory route of monarch butterflies, or the answer to the question, where are all these butterflies going, was solved by Dr. Fred Urquhart and his wife Nora. Dr. Urquhart was a professor at the University of Toronto who for years was studying or trying to uncover the migratory route of these butterflies, which appeared and disappeared and then reappeared every year. In 1975, they actually found the overwintering grounds of the monarch butterflies. And Fred and Nora Urquhart were the pioneers of monarch tagging, which we'll talk about a little later in the presentation. So we really have this history in Canada of studying monarchs, protecting monarchs, and getting everyone involved actively in conserving the species. We have 5 protected areas in southern Ontario that are monarch staging areas. They're outlined in the Monarch Management Conservation Plan. And so these are areas that are already protected space that experience monarch aggregation before they fly south throughout the winter. We also have a lot of citizen science programs. Again, the long history of monarch tagging and other initiatives that have really gotten Canadians involved in monarchs. And we even have some new innovative multi-partner initiatives such as Cooperative Monarch, which is a collaboration between farmers in Quebec and Vermont that's producing milkweed fiber for the textile industry. But the byproduct of growing all this milkweed for textile is that you have all this milkweed from monarch butterflies and then all these milkweed seeds that you can distribute and help encourage more milkweed to be planted with. So we really have quite a lot of initiatives that are hitting on lots of aspects, how everyone, all hands on deck, can help out to conserve monarch butterflies. So where exactly is this habitat now needed? And I've said this already a few times, and I have to drive the point home because it really is everywhere. We need monarch habitat in gardens, we need it in parks and protected areas, we need it on farmland, and we need it on corridors as well. And so the question is, why corridors? We absolutely do need monarch habitat everywhere, but I'll make the case that corridors are really unique in the capacity they have to impact some of the largest change, positive change for monarch butterflies. This is primarily because of the extent of the landscape type. We're looking at roads and utility corridors and railways. These landscape types are all around us. They're connected and they're everywhere. Corridor landscapes also often have prescribed and mandated management. So there's an opportunity to perhaps modify or suggest alternative management that could be better for monarchs with a really high chance for adoption. The geographic area of corridors correlates with key migratory and staging routes, and I'll show you a few slides upcoming that validate this point. And then there are also the connections with other landscapes. So many corridors will travel through an agricultural area or through a conservation area or adjacent to one of the staging areas, another critical habitat. So they help link landscapes together and increase the impact of what others are doing to conserve and protect monarchs and other pollinators. So a little reminder again of what the monarch migration looks like on the map of North America. You can see here that we have monarchs present throughout southern Ontario and southern Quebec, as well as the vast majority of the American Midwest, primarily this region called the Corn Belt, through the American Southwest into the southern United States and then into Mexico. So if we look at railways as a landscape type and we map out where large railway corridors are, they really do cluster and aggregate in these important parts of the monarch flyway. If we look at major roadways, and these are just the major roadways, this does not include all of the municipal and rural roads, which also are everywhere and play a huge role in conservation. But again, you see that where you have a density of roadways is exactly where you have the presence of monarch butterflies. And then lastly, with utility corridors, a little bit more difficult to get an explicit map here, but we see the same clustering of pipelines and overhead transmission lines that are right where the monarch butterflies are passing through and resident throughout the year. And the way that corridors can play a key role in this case in monarch conservation is to look at this approach of restoring, maintaining, and enhancing the landscape to support pollinators and monarch butterflies in particular. So local site-specific actions really do add up to a lot of significant change. Think back at those maps that you saw, the extent of the network that is part of corridor systems and how it maps almost identically to the monarch flyway. So when we talk about these actions, restoring, maintaining, and enhancing, we're looking at restoring the vegetation of a landscape to the natural habitat that existed prior to the corridor or the infrastructure project coming through. This might not always be possible, but it's a goal we want to keep in our minds. We're going to focus most heavily on this concept of maintained landscapes because corridors are managed actively. So we want to make sure that when you're undertaking corridor management activities, be they mowing, treating for weeds, treating for pests if that's something you have to do, other maintenance, that you do it in such a way that minimizes any disturbance and harm to pollinators. And then again, ideally, if we have the flexibility, and this flexibility does exist, often in new capital projects or when a utility company or a railroad or a roadside management organization wants to engage the community, there's an opportunity sometimes to enhance the habitat, make it even better. For those of you that are working and functioning in Ontario, we have two sets of technical guides, one for roadsides and one for utility corridors that look at these techniques, provide best management practices, as well as habitat-specific guidelines for Ontario that promote pollinators in general. Now, these techniques are not unique to Ontario's landscapes, but some of the specific species we mentioned are. But I would recommend anyone have a look at these particular guidelines and have a read through because they really are comprehensive and they can be accessed at pollinator.org/Canada, pollinatorpartnership.ca, as well as the links will be active in the archived content of this webinar. So before we get into some of the best management practices, I wanted to recognize some of the challenges that might be faced by monarchs and other pollinators in managed systems, and understanding things that are part of your role in maintaining safety and reliability with the utility or traffic corridor that you're managing, but also considering how these might impact pollinators. So the use of pesticides on corridor landscapes has an impact on pollinators. There's also some potential concern and risk of mortality associated with mowing. That's direct and indirect as well. The concept of vehicle mortality. So are pollinators and monarch butterflies having negative interactions with traffic, be it railway traffic, motor traffic, etc.? And then there is the concept of, is the habitat being degraded or fragmented as part of the natural management of the system? So these are all concepts that we do have to think about and recognize so that when you're going forward and managing your landscape, you just keep in mind where best you can make adjustments that promote pollinators and monarchs. It's great if you can do it. So just briefly, I did want to talk about pesticide toxicity and pollinators, monarch butterflies in particular. There's a variety of pesticides that may be used in the management of corridor landscapes. Those are primarily going to be herbicides, but pesticides taken as a whole, if we look at the impacts they have on pollinators, insecticides are potentially the most toxic because the majority of pollinators are insects, and absolutely monarch butterflies are insects. So there's a high likelihood that an insecticide would have a negative impact on a monarch butterfly. Fungicides and herbicides, they don't normally harm pollinators directly, but there can be a lot of indirect damage done to pollinator populations and communities when the floral resources that they depend on are removed by herbicides. And this is exactly the scenario that we've seen as one of the driving factors of monarch decline. And overuse of herbicide within agricultural systems has unintentionally removed milkweed and nectar plants that were adjacent to the farm field where they were not posing any threat to productivity. So it's something to be concerned about. It's unlikely that you'd be using miticides and nematicides, but those are also toxic to pollinators. It's possible that you may be using some rodenticides in landscape management, which would be toxic to bat and bird pollinators in particular. But considering some of the landscape management that can occur that would have a detrimental effect on pollinators, with pesticides, we see the most pollinator poisoning, so actual detrimental effects of pollinators resulting when pollinator toxic pesticides are applied during a bloom period or to bloom. This can happen directly where a mistake is in fact made, where blooming plants are sprayed, or indirectly where the pesticide can drift onto an adjoining crop or plant that's nearby, or a water source can be contaminated. There are a few sublethal impacts of pesticides on pollinators and landscapes that are good to be mindful of. And some of those include a change in the development of the larva. It can be slower or faster. They could reduce the reproduction of the pollinator in question. And especially in bees, there's been quite a bit of work that the cognitive ability can be impacted. So pollinators might not be finding flowers as easily. It is very likely that you'll be using herbicides in your landscape management. And it's important to be mindful of some of the impacts that herbicides can have on the pollinator community, as I mentioned before. Primarily, there'll be a change in the plant community composition, which is what you're probably targeting. Get rid of a weed that's causing an issue. But we have to be mindful that we don't remove or destroy the plants that the monarchs are depending on or using. This is quite obvious with milkweed, so it's very easy to say, be mindful of milkweed when you're using any herbicide application. But a little bit harder to do when we're looking at the nectar plants that monarch butterflies might be using. And they very well may be using a nectar source that is a weed that you'll need to remove from the landscape. So it's a bit of a difficult balance that has to be struck in, but it's very approachable. If you deplete the pollen and nectar resources by being too aggressive with herbicide use, and the same is true of mowing, which we'll discuss shortly, you can also have a very negative impact on pollinator populations. And the same is true for removing the host plants for caterpillars. So we do have to be mindful when we are using a herbicide that it's going to remove plants. And which plants is it removing, and are those important to the monarch butterfly and other pollinators in the landscape? So as I mentioned briefly with mowing, there's a similar challenges of removing the food source and changing the plant community. But there's also an additional challenge of perhaps the direct mortality of mower blades and caterpillars that don't have the same ability to escape mowing that a winged form of an insect can. So it's good to keep in mind that while this does involve a large portion of the summer maintenance season, monarch butterfly caterpillars are present in southern Ontario and southern Quebec from May through September, so the end of May through September. So mowing either prior to that or late in the season is ideal. And again, I'm very mindful of the fact that this is the entire summer, so it's just something that you do have to keep in mind if you have to mow in that period. Be mindful of milkweed, perhaps mow around milkweed if possible, as not to disturb the caterpillars. So we basically have some best management practices that result from what we know you have to do when you manage a landscape and what we know the actual impact could be on monarch butterflies. So we want to promote and consider annual or biannual mowing if possible. So mow once a year or mow before and after the residency of the monarch butterfly. There is some research that indicates that when you mow early in the season, and that's around May before the monarch caterpillars start to become present, that this can actually increase the growth of milkweed. So there's a benefit to timing your mowing and mowing early in the season. Another thing to consider when you do mow is you want to mow when the majority of plants are past their bloom or when the caterpillars have completed their development. So target that once or twice a year mowing to when you're not going to be removing food sources, again, if possible. What we also promote is leaving some areas unmowed and only mowing the clear zone. As well as we want you to prioritize considering obviously mowing during the day, which is logically when you would be mowing, but on bright sunny days where pollinators are very, very active, which increases their chance of getting out of your way when you're mowing. So just to drive home the point of the best management practice actually that you can do, keeping in mind all of the points we made about how you might mow, is to mow only the essential clear zone of your operation along a roadside or next to a railway or underneath hydro lines. Only mow where you absolutely have to and tolerate and leave the rest of the area as unmowed habitats. Some best management practices for insecticide use now. Again, recognizing this is probably the one of the least likely actions that you would have. But if you are perhaps targeting a pest that needs to be targeted, just be mindful of these best management practices for pollinators and other monarchs. So we're always advocating diagnosing a pest problem and ensuring that the chemical control is the only necessary and likely measure that would work. We're recommending you complete your insecticide application before the plants that pollinators are foraging on bloom. So again, if it's possible to target your pest before nectar plants and milkweed are in bloom, that's ideal. In terms of the time of day when you might be doing any application, there's a high recommendation for targeting less active pollinator seasons early in the season, late in the season, as well as before 9 a.m. and after 5 p.m. during the day. So we want to avoid that risk of the direct hit of a pollinator, monarch butterfly or other, with an insecticide. Establish a buffer zone around where you're applying any insecticide, especially if you have nearby foraging areas. So in many cases, you may have a roadside that's adjacent to a farm property, or perhaps it's near a natural area or a conservation area. So be mindful of establishing buffer zones and not spraying everywhere, just where the target area is. Of course, minimizing the drift that can happen, because that's a significant factor. And always checking the weather conditions before applying any pesticide, insecticide, or herbicide. Being mindful again that the optimal conditions are a mild breeze where there's a lot of surface area mixing, and where the wind direction is taking you away from sensitive areas. Similarly, with herbicide use, a little bit repetitive, but always important to remember, we have the same message. We advocate practicing integrative vegetation management, IVM. So making use of all tools that you have at your disposal and going for the chemical option as a last resort, but also considering what the impacts of each might be on monarch butterflies and pollinators. Making sure that your weed level is at a point where the control is necessary for herbicide use is a key principle of integrative vegetation management. And of course, we're always going to say eliminate or minimize the use of the chemical, but if you are using it, just as with insecticides, complete the application before the foraging plants are in bloom or once they're past bloom. We do recommend treating a landscape in thirds if possible to avoid a food desert, which is one of the biggest concerns we have with herbicide use. Again, monarch butterflies depend on milkweed and nectar plants. So if possible, do not treat the entire landscape each year. Again, minimize drift and broadcast spraying because you don't want to impact habitat near your target area. Using backpack applicators is ideal, again, if possible, in herbicide systems rather than using a spray rig. But of course, if you are using a spray rig, we want to remind you of best practices where shutting off spray nozzles when making turns or when nearing areas that have water in them, garden areas, other sensitive habitat. Now, a question that we get asked a lot is, what is the impact of road salt on native plants or pollinators in general? And this is an area where we're a little bit stuck. Unfortunately, the local native plants that support pollinators, including monarch butterflies in Canada's landscapes, are not generally salt tolerant. So the best management practice within your standard operational regime for road salting is to have native plantings that are intended to support monarch butterflies and other pollinators away or upslope from areas that accumulate salt. So consider the hydrology of your roadside landscape and where runoff might go before making any planting or seeding actions for pollinator seeds. If you do have the same seed mix everywhere, what you will just notice is that unfortunately the native pollinator plants will not grow well or will not grow at all in areas that accumulate salt. Another question that comes to mind quite often is in terms of pollinator habitat. Where exactly do pollinators, are pollinators damaged or killed by traffic? Now there is a little bit of research that traffic speed and volume are the greatest factors. So yes, you do have some mortality. The greatest mortality has been seen at speeds of about 50 miles per hour, 80 kilometers per hour. Slower speeds and faster speeds tend to show reduced mortality. But we do know from the research that habitat along roadsides does not seem to be a sink for pollinators. So there have been a lot of papers published actually on roadside mortality. So just reiterating some of this, the numbers can get quite high when we've tried to account for, does traffic impact pollinators? And the answer is, well, yes, it does impact pollinators. Quite large numbers have been estimated to have been killed on roadsides. For example, 20 million butterflies in a week in Illinois. However, what a lot of research studies have seen is that there hasn't really been a lot of direct mortality along roadsides designed to attract bees or other pollinators. Now, there was a paper published in 2015 that assessed the amount of insects killed on North America's roadways as 100 million insects annually killed. However, this particular paper assessed roadsides that were not habitat roadsides. And we have really good evidence that shows when roadsides are managed as habitat, You have a reduction in mortality because the insects, pollinators and other beneficial insects are physically using the habitat and not moving across the road in search of habitat. So there's a net benefit to managing landscapes for pollinators. And that brings up another question that commonly gets asked: are roadsides barriers to pollinator movement? And in fact, the answer is that they're not really barriers to pollinator movement. Bumblebees cross roads, butterflies cross roads, bees have been observed to cross the road. So while the landscape is fragmented, there's still a lot of connectivity and benefits you can gain from seeding pollinator habitats. But again, to point out, bees tend not to crisscross roads when they're feeding on good quality habitats. So there shouldn't be the concern that roads can create sinks for pollinators or monarch butterflies. They're a net benefit once again. So the final set of best management practices that we have are in creating habitat. We want to make sure that we provide continuous bloom in terms of nectar and pollen sources from early spring through to fall with native plants, and that means May through September. We want to include larval host plants for butterflies like milkweed monarchs in seed mixes that are used. We want to maintain local native seed sources if possible, because these attract your local pollinators and usually do better in the local ecosystem. It's very common to include grass in seed mixes because it grows well, stabilizes hillsides and slopes, prevents erosion, but we want to exclude non-native grasses from seed mixes and preferentially use native grasses as a net benefit to the local ecosystem. And when you are creating habitats, there's always the question of whether to use seeds, plugs, or potted plants, or a combination of sources. And that's something you need to consider with whoever the landscape manager is. Working with other local nonprofit organizations or conservation groups can help answer that question. And if you are planting a habitat garden, clustering plants together makes it more efficient for pollinators to forage. So you get better results if you have large patches of flowers of the same type together. So there are a few best management practices there. There's been a little bit of development on monarch-specific seed mixes. And basically, these seed mixes can take many forms, but the best success is seen when there's been a 50-50 ratio of the grass to the forb or flowering plant. So again, having 50% native grass and then 50% native plants in the seed mix is ideal. When we look at how many species of plants we're looking for, 9 species that flower throughout the year, 3 in the spring, 3 in the summer, and 3 in the late summer, are considered minimum standards. So if you're designing a seed mix that doesn't exist yet, or if you're using an off-the-shelf mix, have a look at what species are in it and what their bloom periods are. And remembering also that the late summer is key for monarch feeding. So just a quick summary on what the best management practices are. What you can do: adjust your mowing, adjust your herbicide use, and adopt seed mixes that include nectar plants and milkweed in particular. So now that we've gone over what the best management practices are, simplify them as much as possible, the next question that comes up is, where along your corridor do you place pollinator habitat? Is every location the right location? Is every location a good location? Well, you can place monarch habitat anywhere along the right-of-way, perhaps by buildings and infrastructure that are part of your landscapes, on easements that are owned by you, public buildings that could be a good outreach message, or even off-site in the community. So being mindful that not every utility company or roadside manager has direct access to management choices on their lands, keeping in mind that easements are often in place. There are a lot of places you can help support monarch habitat, even if it's not going to be directly on your landscape. So within those habitat guides that I showed earlier on in the presentation, we have some graphics that showcase where along this example here, roadsides, you can do what action to support monarchs and other pollinators. So for example, if you consider the type of maintenance that's much more common along primary expressways, you'll be doing a lot of mowing or herbicide use to take care of potential weed issues. So we're really focusing on those best management practices that minimize the potential negative impacts of mowing and herbicide use. On areas near businesses or perhaps areas that are more secondary roads, you can do a lot more habitat gardening, for example. Local avenues and boulevards and roundabouts are great locations for dense plantings that are like gardens. Adjusting your seed mix if you're doing restoration or maintenance work along other roadsides is a great strategy for large highways as well. So it's not that every strategy has to be used everywhere. It's that you have a lot of options when managing road networks with how you can support monarch butterflies and other pollinators. Similarly, we can look at what kind of enhancements on corridors support monarch habitat or within the whole gas and electric generation spectrum. So utility corridors, hydro lines, are amazing areas for pollinator habitats. And that habitat can be enhanced or created by, again, minimizing and adjusting mowing or herbicide use, actively seeding habitats when you have a new capital project, maybe even managing a garden, especially in areas that are public facing. So for example, a buffer zone around a utility corridor, around a solar field, at the base of a wind generation facility. All these areas are likely candidates for where you can improve monarch butterfly habitats. And while we don't have a guide yet directed that speaks to railways, the same is true for railway corridors, where you can consider areas along tracks that are maintained and mowed for visibility as areas where you can implement some pollinator support strategies. Railway stations that are either more rural or perhaps more urbanized can be ideal sites to actually install pollinator habitats, little mini gardens, even in planters. So I just wanted to present to you a short list in this webinar of some of the species you may want to pick in particular for your habitats. Again, this being an archived webinar, you'll have access to this list, so it's a great resource. In terms of the Asclepias plants in Canada, there's quite a few that grow throughout Canada, but I'm highlighting here again the 3 Asclepias species: Asclepias serica, common milkweed; Asclepias incarnata, swamp milkweed; and Asclepias tuberosa, butterfly milkweed. These plants, these 3 particular milkweeds, are ones that you should really consider sourcing for any of your seeding or garden or restoration projects. Again, keeping in mind that the vast majority of monarch butterflies in Canada will be in Ontario and Quebec. However, Manitoba and New Brunswick do still have significant populations. So focusing on those species, they'll likely be available and they'll provide a really, really good resource. The next list I've posted here is 12 nectar plants that are widely used by monarchs. This particular list was developed using some research on what was actually documented in the literature, other naturalists, other conservation groups, where they physically saw monarchs feeding. So we have records of these plants being great for monarchs. Remember that monarch butterflies are generalist species, so they actually will eat and feed off of a whole variety of plants. But if you consider the top 12 that we have the most support for, spreading dogvane, Indian help, marsh marigold, field thistle, tall coreopsis, pale purple coneflower, eastern purple coneflower, wood lily, Virginia bluebells, golden ragwort, wild blue phlox, and common blue violet. These plants, they're beautiful. They have a great planting palette. They're available. You can see this mix provides nectar throughout the entire season. So considering adding these species into any seed mix or garden planting you do would be a big benefit to monarch butterflies. And the last question I want to address is where exactly we need monarch habitat. Well, we do need it everywhere. but we want to prioritize monarch habitat near staging areas, near shorelines, because monarchs navigate by flying near shorelines. That's how they visually map where they need to go. Another priority of where we might need monarch habitat more in one area than another is near existing conservation areas to basically double the impact of that conservation area. Within agricultural areas where there's been a deficit of monarch habitat, we also would want to prioritize adding habitat there. So I want to show you an image of where the primary monarch staging areas are. There's 6 of them that are identified. They're in Southern Ontario. One of them is Long Point Wildlife Refuge, Point Pelee National Park, Presqu'île Provincial Park, Prince Edward National Wildlife Area, Rondeau Provincial Park, and Tommy Thompson Park. If you have a landscape that you manage that's near any of these areas, it's incredibly valuable because it'll help support and promote monarchs more so, and especially in the fall season. So this is just to consider, you know, if you can make your efforts in a landscape that geographically, this is where we do want to focus even more so. I do want to just do a little quick overview of how you might actually work together and set up a functional habitat on your landscape. So we talked a lot about management, how you manage your day-to-day activities, adjust your mowing, adjust your herbicide use, maybe change your seeding list for restoration projects. Those are all amazing approaches to overall across your whole landscape, make the landscape better for monarchs. But often there is a desire to create a habitat, a garden that has more of a visual impact, that integrates the community. So just a quick step-by-step on how you might go about creating a garden, either directly on your landscape or at a partner location. Site selection is very important, so not every site can or should be a garden. Having a plan, a budget, and a design is very important. Site preparation cannot be overlooked because if it's not done correctly, all of your efforts will be lost to weeds, unfortunately. Establishing the plants, especially if you're using plug plants. It's not always as simple as throwing seeds down. Sometimes you definitely do want to plant some plants, and then maintenance and management. So because we're running a little bit long, I'll just go through these very quickly. When you want to select a site, we really are looking for an area that behaves most like an open prairie with great sun exposure. We also want to make sure that the site we're selecting for an intensive garden is not going to be one that will be heavily impacted by our management or pesticide use or nearby management, so just mindful site location. You definitely need a timeline and a budget. So you have to recognize that when we're doing gardens, you have to be patient, that native plants take a little bit longer to grow than what we might be used to in more commercial varieties. Your timing will have you seeding or doing planting activities either early in the spring or late in the fall. And when you do design your plant palette, we've mentioned these aspects before, we're looking for locally adapted species, 3 species flowering each season, and 50% grass ratio in your landscape. There's actually quite a few tools out there, in addition to the resources that we have at Pollinator Partnership, that help you create a seed mix based on what your budget is, which plant species you like. So I absolutely encourage you to use some of these tools. Site preparation. Eradicating the weeds or the weed seed bank is crucial. And there's a few ways this can be done, and I know that I spent quite a bit of time talking about not using herbicide or reducing it, but if we are going forward with planting a garden, we do need to be relatively aggressive in preparing the site. The non-herbicide route here is solarization or perhaps burning or disking. However, herbicide is a viable option too to prepare the site. And then maintaining and managing the site. We have a lot of best management practices that we presented, but I do want to highlight the fact that it's a long-term process, even when it's a garden. So mowing the habitat regularly in the first year can help with establishment of the habitat. Again, a little bit different than what we're talking about reducing mowing on your natural maintenance. And in the long term, we do actually want to make sure that we mow once a year to make sure that the habitat that you planted and created stays the same. And then obviously enjoy your habitat with a little rhyme that we like to use, that the first year a prairie sleeps, the second year a prairie creeps, and the third year it leaps. So there is a bit of a waiting game when you create a habitat, either seeded or planted, using native plants. It may take a little while to get it established. So there's partnerships that you can use to help plant gardens. Your partners can be local communities, schools, First Nations groups, and they can help with finding funding, providing technical expertise, and the labor involved in developing a garden habitat on your utility lands. If you're near agriculture, again, you can have really valuable benefits to having monarch gardens near agriculture. So I would really encourage you to reach out to other community groups, Farms at Work, Alice, soil and crop improvement associations, again, for some of these perhaps collaborative incentives to be able to work on habitat development. And I have 3 brief case studies to present to you that really showcase how some of these collaborations have worked and where other members in corridor management, be that railroads or roadsides, have done unique projects that are benefiting pollinators using some of these principles. The first is the Corridors for Life project. It's a partnership between Hydro One, Algoma Power, Pollinator Partnership as well, Sioux College, and the Algoma Highlands Conservancy. And what this project is actually doing is it's conducting active research to assess the resources along utility rights of ways in Algoma for pollinators, looking at what the baseline availability is of milkweed and other species that are important and what pollinators are present. So this is a collaborative that's really focusing on assessing how the management that's conducted today, herbicide and mowing, impacts pollinators to help us develop an even better understanding of right-of-way management and any kind of mowing and herbicide use management. So that's a wonderful case study that's just started last year and is getting some good results coming back in. The next case study is a great example of multiple partnerships and using multiple approaches that couple conservation practices together. So the Herb Gray Parkway is an example where a very large capital investment project in infrastructure renewal was linked to some natural habitat development, specifically tall grass prairie seeding along the length of all these new capital projects, which were looking at improving motorist safety. In the instances where they had to do restoration seeding, the seed mix that was used was of native tall grass prairie, and there are some great benefits now of increased pollinator habitat on large areas and new areas of the roadside. So it's again something to think of as an example if you're engaging in any capital investment building project, to think from the bottom up when you have your seeding and restoration and management plan, incorporate monarchs and pollinators into that. And lastly, the Roadsides program. This Roadsides program is founded and run by Carol Dunk, a wonderful lady from Barrie, who has developed a template for pollinator garden patches that works perfectly along roadsides. And what's great about this particular program is it's an example of how her advocacy work has just enabled making the pollinator garden easier and accessible. So if you are a roadside manager or any corridor manager and you want a pollinator garden, you don't know where to start, you can just use the pollinator patch template, exactly how many plants, where to plant them, and it's a great way to ramp up and make that pollinator habitat creation easier in template form. So there's some really good examples of how you can, in addition to changing management, engage in these active pollinator management, pollinator habitat creation programs. It's happened before, so we're all pioneers here. When you do it on your landscape, it'll be great, but we're not starting from scratch. There's a lot of resources out there to help you. And lastly, before we close up, I just want to mention about some of the other programs you can engage in. as part of your pollinator habitat support, one of which is monitoring, outreach, and citizen science. So a lot of the activities you're doing on your roadside or your corridor or your other right-of-way landscape involve actively managing your landscape. You're probably monitoring weeds and other wildlife, etc. So there's ways to kind of tap in, if it's of interest and to your population, to some of these larger monitoring and outreach programs that are already there working with monarchs. There have been a lot of monarch programs that have helped us map the migration, assess populations, enhance planting programs, and then register habitats so we really get an idea if we're getting close to those metrics we outlined for how much monarch habitat we need. So monarch tagging is a great program that anyone can participate in. If you are interested in doing any outreach to the community, being involved in a monarch tagging program is a great idea. So basically, you get a little sticker and you tag a butterfly with the date, and you make note of the date and location when you apply your tag. Then you find a tag, perhaps you find a tag. You can email or call back with the tag number and its actual location and how you found the butterfly. Was it, did it look like it had some damage? Was it just on the side of the road? Which landscape it was in? It's a great program that actually has resulted in the understanding of not only where monarch butterflies are going, but how many monarch butterflies are actually produced where. So we know that actually in Canada, we'd say we produce roughly 20% of the monarch butterflies that make it down to the overwintering grounds in Mexico. And that's not insignificant. So it further drives the point that our actions are very important. Another program that you can participate in, and more along the lines of a citizen scientist, is the Journey North, which simply maps monarch butterflies' arrival and departure dates throughout North America. This kind of data has helped us understand when we need to start being concerned, for example, about monarchs being present and modifying herbicide and mowing practices so we don't impact them. And citizen science outreach, primarily through the World Wildlife Fund, monitors the size of the overwintering colonies in Mexico. So that's where we get that data about how large the colonies are and where we need to go in terms of conservation. There are a lot of planting programs available at your disposal. We have a series of planting guides that provide ecologically, ecoregionally specific planting lists that can help you promote monarchs in addition to other pollinators. So these resources are out there. And we always recommend that you register and get recognized for any actions that you do on your landscape. So as a municipal, public, private, corporate land manager, you can register your monarch habitat with the Million Pollinator Garden Challenge. It's a North American initiative that's mapping where we have habitat, where we don't, where we might need it. And the goal is to get to 1 million pollinator gardens by 2020. Specifically in terms of what municipalities can do and organizations can do, so this might speak to some of you here on the webinar, there's the Monarch Mayor's Pledge, which is a series of actions that a municipality can take, and they definitely include roadside management within that municipality that promote monarchs. If you're interested in taking the Monarch Mayor's Pledge within Canada, the David Suzuki Foundation is administering and promoting the Monarch Mayor's Pledge. In the United States, it's the National Wildlife Federation, and in Mexico, it's Profana and Programa Correo Real Mariposa Monarca. And if you're a corporate partner, corporate entity, there's a lot of recognition you can get for doing actions on your landscape, roadside management, corridor management, corporate campus management for monarchs. The Wildlife Habitat Council registers and certifies wildlife habitat, and they're particularly interested in pollinator support. And there is actually a specific award targeted at roadside management throughout North America that is given out by the North American Roadside Management Association and Pollinator Partnership jointly. for best roadside management for pollinators and monarchs inclusive. So I would encourage you to, apply for that if you have a great corridor management program in place. So we ran a tiny bit longer than expected. I'll pause for questions now. There's still quite a few of you on the webinar, so thank you for holding on for the question period. And thank you also for your attention and for participating in the webinar. I will stand back and let Georgina have the floor to field any questions that you may have.
Thank you very much, Vicki. Thank you for this really interesting and really comprehensive webinar. We have some questions, but before I start reading them out, I just want to remind all the participants that this webinar is going to be available at both the CEC and the Pollinator Partnership websites in the near future. And also we would like to mention that we will have a French version of this webinar also available in our websites at a later stage. So I'm going to start with the questions. The first one says, what about invasive species as a challenge faced by monarchs as they outcompete the milkweed and other native flowering species?
No, and I really appreciate the question. And so in invasive species management, this is why one of the best management practices we promote is an assessment of the actual risk. And in some cases, for example, dog strangling vine is a plant that is very similar to milkweed and mimics milkweed enough in that monarch butterflies do lay their eggs on it, and those caterpillars will not survive. So there are, for the host plants, there are definitely invasive species that will outcompete and are undesirable. And in that case, we would recommend the approach being to aggressively remove those from the landscape. With nectar plants, there tends to be a little bit of a trade-off where pollinators, monarchs included, tend to like weedy species or species we define as weedy. So in that respect, on the nectar plant side of things, we do advocate some caution, and if it's not a noxious weed, and a stepwise approach to transition the landscape slowly to a more desirable native plant landscape away from the weedy landscape, recognizing that the weed may unfortunately be a very good sole source of food at this point in time.
Thank you, Vicki. I have another question for you. If you have to control wild parsnip in Ontario, which is the law, it needs to be controlled before they set seed in August and September. Otherwise, they will continue to spread. Mowing by May is not an option, as they will just grow bigger, and mowing after September will just spread the seeds. Is the use of a herbicide that doesn't kill milkweed the preferred option?
It would be, but it's really difficult to, just trying to answer this as correctly as I can. It's a little rare for there to be herbicides that are so targeted that they don't have any negative impact on another broadleaf plant, like a milkweed's a broadleaf plant. So if that would be the case, that would be great, but it's not as likely. So unfortunately, with some weed issues, we are in a scenario where the best management for the weed is in conflict with what we would suggest for monarch butterflies. So in those particular scenarios, what would be recommended is monitoring the landscape, walking the landscape, and seeing if you actually have significant caterpillar presence. And you can pick them out often. They're quite visible. They're about 10 centimeters large. And making that choice before you actually either mow or use a herbicide to make sure that you're not going to harm caterpillars. So it's tricky, and I definitely recognize that that could be an issue. But in balancing risk, my suggestion would be to mow while monarchs are still resident if you can be sure that there aren't caterpillars physically on the plant that you'll unfortunately kill through mowing. So check first. and do proceed with mowing in that case, because you do want to make sure you can still manage the landscape in such a way that we're promoting native plants, native biodiversity, and protecting monarchs. So difficult scenario, but that's the kind of stuff that we like to work with to create management plans of how to target it at a site-specific level. Thanks.
Thank you, Vicki. And just to elaborate a little bit on that question about herbicide use to target wild parsnip, would it be fair to say using a broadleaf herbicide by the spot spraying process targeting specifically at wild parsnip be the best approach?
That is a strategy we do recommend, backpack spraying targeting individual plants. So yes, but I don't want to deter any land managers from participating in our programs by suggesting something that they know could be incredibly labor intensive. So it is absolutely ideal target spray, but if you have a extensive landscape, it can become very time consuming and costly. So absolutely recommended, knowing that it might not be the cheapest option. So that might not make it appealing, but it is better.
Thanks, Vicki. I'm just going to continue with the questions because I think participants are really eager to make you those questions. We are mindful of the time, so we're just going to continue reading the questions. And people that have stayed this long, we really thank you very much. The next question says, if vegetation is removed around an existing milkweed patch, will the milkweed spread or seed into this area?
It can. So milkweed is it's a perennial plant, so it definitely grows from year to year and grows thicker from year to year. From seed, milkweeds tend to be considered weak competitors where they sometimes are outcompeted by other native plants or grasses. So removing the vegetation from around stands of milkweed is a way to encourage more milkweed. Often in landscapes that have a lot of grass, we recommend even herbicide treatments to just remove all the grass so that then milkweed could potentially come up from the native seed bank. So that is a good strategy.
Thanks. Then the next question is, why a 50-50 flowers grass mix?
And that's because there's just been research in how long your habitat lasts. So when you have about 50% grasses by volume and 50% flowering plants in the physical amount of seed you buy and distribute on the landscape, the studies show that the habitat and the native plant, the flowering plant portion of that landscape lasts longer than if you have a lot of flowering plants. So basically, that recommendation is to let you know that you don't have to have wall-to-wall flowering plants like a beautiful, would look beautiful in pictures, but a dense meadow, because that dense meadow will look great in the first year, and then the plants will start competing with themselves, and over time, it won't be as productive and as diverse. But the 50-50 grass plant ratio has been shown in restoration to provide a habitat that lasts much longer through time. Also keeping in mind that the habitats we're recommending for pollinators, for monarch butterflies, are early successional meadow habitats. So their natural tendency is to change over time, and they do require maintenance such as annual mowing to keep them in that habitat that we want for monarchs.
Thank you, Vicki. And I'm going to make the last questions, but I really encourage all the participants to email Vicki at her email address, which is being shown in the screen, if you have any further questions. Do we have a good idea of the cost per hectare when managing a utility corridor for monarch butterfly?
We don't really have a good calculation yet on the actual maintenance cost investments per hectare. There's a little bit of research that's come out. Actually, the only piece I can point to that puts numbers on it yet is from southern Florida. So it's not really the same landscape as Ontario, obviously, but they've shown a decrease in overall maintenance costs. So it's answering your question backwards. However, we do have very good data on how much an acre or a hectare of seeded habitat costs to install. The numbers they mostly come again from agriculture, which still tends to work in acres. It can be, in terms of the seed mix, somewhere around $200 to $400 an acre in seed mix at the right ratio, right density. So again, not answering your question directly, but there's some costs that are known. They'll likely change, but we do know that good quality habitat, once it's established, tends to require less maintenance. So the best we can say is over time, it costs less. Even though there is an upfront cost, a grass mix is usually $100 or less per acre. It can be even less than that. So we're talking $200 to $300 to $400 for the wildflower mix, but the investment pays off in terms of biodiversity and long-term habitat value.
Thank you very much, Vicki, and we really want to thank all the participants for staying for this question period. Thank you very much, Vicki, for this very interesting webinar, and it's all on our side. I don't know if you want to add anything before we sign off.
Well, no, I just, again, thank you, everyone. We ran a bit over time because the topic is interesting and there's a lot to say, but please do email me at vw@pollinator.org for any questions that haven't been answered. Or just in general, if there was something that wasn't discussed, because there's a lot of opportunity to really make corridors the area where monarchs are being protected and promoted in Canada. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Vicki.